Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, episode 84, Louis XVI, the ill-fated King of France. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all of our listeners and supporters that if you'd like to donate to our podcast monetarily, please go to patreon.com/Generals and Napoleon. If you'd like to support our podcast in other ways, please go to Spotify, Apple, or anywhere podcasts are heard and give us a review and rating. As always, we thank you for your support. Now, on with the show. We have a crown favorite back on the call today. We have our good friend Charles Mackay. How are you, Charles?
I'm doing great. How are you, John?
I'm well. For those of you who don't know, Charles has been on many previous episodes. He's always a fantastic guest. He's also a graduate of the Institute of French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Studies at Florida State, and we're thrilled to have him back on. And he also has a Twitter page, correct, Charles?
I do.
It's Bubbles Vampire, or Bubbles the Vampire, and he has a lot of great content that goes up there. And what caught my eye a few weeks ago was the subject of who we're going to talk about today. Who is that, Charles?
King Louis XVI.
That's right. Okay, so we all know this is the king who preceded the French Revolution and was there before Napoleon, but it's very important to learn about his downfall and his life before we get to the French Revolution. So let's dive in. He was born in August 1754 as Louis Auguste. Is it Auguste?
Auguste, yeah.
Auguste, the Duke of Berry, at the Palace of Versailles. What do we know about his upbringing?
Well, it was mixed. Unfortunately, a lot of death surrounded the palace. His father was sort of, and his grandfather too, King Louis XV, was super obsessed with. Smallpox was always the scourge of 18th century Europe, and that, of course, spared no social class. But in this particular case, the Bourbons were particularly susceptible, it seems, to tuberculosis. Louis was actually the seventh born of his parents, but all six of the previous children were either stillborn, or died in infancy.
Awesome.
Except his older brother, the fourth born, Louis made it until he was about 10 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So he did know his older brother, who was originally going to be the Dauphin. And then, of course, when Louis Joseph dies, then Louis XVI, future Louis XVI, becomes the Dauphin after his father dies early and his mother shortly after that, which I think you wanted to ask about.
Yeah, I do. His father dies of tuberculosis in 1765 when young Louis is just 11. And his mom never really recovers from the loss of her husband. She dies a few years later in 1767. How do you think this affected the future king?
It's tough to be surrounded by, so much death and sadness as Louis enjoyed in his childhood. Enjoyed isn't the right word. Endured, I think, might be a better word.
Yeah.
Yes, during his childhood. Although he did have some close relationships. His younger brothers, who were going to be the, future Louis XVIII and future Charles X, kings of France both. He had a good relationship with them, and folks at the court noted that Louis himself was a robust child in good health, physically active, enjoyed sports, enjoyed wrestling with his brothers. But Louis had an especially close relationship with his grandfather, Louis XV, and they would frequently go hunt together.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that was one of Louis's favorite pastimes, and especially with his grandfather. And although he and his grandfather, in terms of personality, could not have been more different, they both really enjoyed and bonded over the extended hunting trips they would take on the grounds of Versailles.
Yeah, it sounds idyllic in terms of scenery and background, but you're right. It was a lot of, mental turmoil to have to go through at a young age.
Yeah, and Louis was not fond of court life, and it might bear just a tiny bit of review for some folks who may not be aware of what court life was like at Versailles. The every aspect of the king was witnessed literally from day to night. There was a ritual set up around, morning time, waking up. There was a ritual all throughout the day, meal times, bedtime. The royal couples, the king and queen, uh, had to perform their, procreative duties to get an heir, with an audience watching. And then
Wow.
royal births were attended by members of the court. There was one estimation that when Marie Antoinette finally delivered a child, there were 220 people in the room. And there were so many people, it was so stifling. She had passed out from not only the exertion, of course, but also from the heat in there until they finally opened the windows and could get some cool air.
Right.
So every moment of a royal's life was on display, and imagine getting virtually no privacy whatsoever. And Louis did not handle that well. He really enjoyed getting out of the grounds of Versailles.
Right.
Treasured those times hunting, especially with his grandfather.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, he becomes the Dauphin or king in waiting. How did he do in school? It seems like he was quite intelligent.
Yeah, he really was. He received a spotty education. He was well grounded in classics, as you might imagine. He did particularly well in history. He excelled at mathematics and geometry. He picked up a lot of the ideas of the Enlightenment through his education with his tutors and things. He enjoyed lockmaking and the technical elements of design and manufacturer. And when things would get tough at Versailles, he had basically a little workshop for his
Hmm.
locks in the attic of Versailles,
Right.
and he would go there to escape the pressures of court life. And I mean, he would tinker with locks for hours and hours. So if he wasn't out hunting, he was probably up squirreled away tinkering with locks. But he was quite intelligent and well read.
But
But
sounds like a bit of an introvert using a current day word.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
Well, in 1770, at the age of 15, he marries the soon to be famous Marie Antoinette from Austria.
Hmm.
This is a whirlwind of change again in 4 years for the young heir apparent. Losing your parents and then getting married at 15. How was their marriage, at least initially?
Uh, well, it wasn't really much of one. These two, as used, now remember they're teenagers. He's 15, she's 14.
Hmm.
Um, and she is the last born child of Maria Theresa of Austria. So, of all of her children, she's the one that gets the least attention because I I'm going from memory, John, but I think Maria Theresa had 13 or 14 children.
Wow.
So, I mean, by the time you get that far down, on the production chain here, there was not a lot of time and effort put into Marie Antoinette's education because, frankly, nobody really thought it was going to be necessary. But
Yeah.
because of the diplomatic revolution in the 18th century and the rise of Prussia, traditional rivals, enemies perhaps even, France and Austria formed an alliance, and the bond for that was the marriage of the Dauphin with Marie Antoinette. And these two are, as individuals, are just initially mismatched.
Right.
Louis is quiet and contemplative and sober, and Marie Antoinette is, she's 14, so
Yeah.
she's vivacious, she's lovely, she was a good dancer and a good musician. She liked parties, and personality wise,
But,
they're not well suited for one another. And
and
Louis meets her 2 days before their marriage. So, I mean, they don't even really know each other once they're married.
so they met only 2 days before, and I remember something that I think it's tradition, but at the border she had to leave like everything Austrian behind her. She couldn't take like any of her, clothes or
That's correct. There
each.
was an island there at the Rhine where they meet, and so they met on the island, and they had some tents erected. And she gets out of all of her Austrian gowns and everything, and then steps into everything French. She can't bring her ladies in waiting. She can't even bring her favorite dog. I
Mm.
mean, she's literally a stranger in a strange land. which would be difficult enough, but initially, well, I won't even say initially, just perpetually, the French public hated her because of the rivalry France had had with Austria for hundreds of years.
Right.
She
Right.
didn't help herself much, and perhaps we'll do an episode on Marie Antoinette and we can talk more about it. But she was reviled in France. I mean, even before she stepped onto French soil.
Right. And after some struggles conceiving, the couple have 4 children. What do we know about these 4 that Marie Antoinette and Louis had?
Yeah, and I want to back up for just a skosh if I could,
Sure.
because the marriage is not consummated for 7 years. 7
7 years.
years, the marriage is not consummated. And of course, they know this because court life and everybody watching and waiting. Now, initially, this was struck up to the fact that these are teenagers,
Right.
and they all know each other and whatever. 7 years is a long time to wait. A long time people thought that perhaps Louis had a problem with his equipment that was ultimately fixed with surgery. More recent evidence has come out that that's in fact not the case.
Yeah.
Louis did not want the surgery. Louis's doctors did not recommend that surgery. An adult circumcision was the cause for the possible ailment there, but ain't nobody interested in doing that.
No, no, not as an
So,
adult. No, and I read
right.
that like they thought that would fix the problem, but
Right. So that's been largely discredited as the years have gone on. And we really think now, in light of more modern research, that frankly, Louis and Marie Antoinette just didn't know what to do.
mhm.
Louis had had no education in that field. I'm not entirely sure he was all that interested in uh, sexual relations with anybody. He never had a mistress. Um, but there was a seminal moment where Marie Antoinette's brother, Joseph II of Austria, the Austrian emperor, paid a personal visit. And for days and days, Joseph and Louis would go out hunting. And they actually formed a pretty close bond. And, Joseph was older and kind of, I think, had some conversations with Louis and ended up coaching Louis. And lo and behold, finally, after 7 years, Marie Antoinette finally does give birth to her first child, which happened to be a girl.
Mhm.
Marie Theresa Charlotte, named after, of course, Marie's mother, Maria
Right.
Theresa, and Charlotte, her favorite sister, comes along, and she's the firstborn, and then has a son, Louis Joseph, and all of France is super excited about that and super pleased. And then a few years later, Louis Charles came along, so now we've got, as we talked about earlier, the heir and the spare. And then finally, a fourth child, Sophie, came along in 1786. Unfortunately, she only lasts a year
Mm.
and died probably of tuberculosis.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to those kids here later in the story.
Okay.
In 1774, he becomes King Louis XVI of France, so he gets on the throne. But what obstacles was France facing at this time?
France was a little bit of a paradox in the 18th century. By any measure, France was the most prosperous of all of the Western European countries, had one of the greatest populations, had a vibrant economy. However, France was in an ever deepening financial crisis,
Mm-hmm.
largely because in France they had divided their society into what they called 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and then everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And the clergy and the nobility historically had enjoyed they did not have to pay taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So the burden of the taxation of the French state fell to the third estate. And that was beginning to get onerous as the 18th century wore on. And the interest on loans that the French state had to make were becoming really, really worrisome.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it falls to Louis to take care of that. And then, of course, there are the normal things that any monarch would have to face during that day. There are periodic famines, and those get worse as we get into the 1780s. European politics is still volatile. We've had the 7 Years' War and the aftermath of that, the rise of Russia as a state. So they're foreign policy pressures. And if Louis had some faults, he did not handle stress particularly well,
Mm-hmm.
and he was not considered a decisive monarch.
Mm.
So, in moments of crisis, Louis would often just sort of vanish, and either he would be up in his attic playing with locks, or he would go hunting. And critical decisions that should be made went days, sometimes weeks, before Louis would make a decision.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned those two things, because that's two things Napoleon was very good at.
Yeah, absolutely. You got the exact opposite issue there. And then, of course, Louis is beset by all kind. His ministers all have opinions, and that's of course why you have ministers, to help provide some guidance for the state and then carry through projects. But you essentially had a group of Louis's ministers who very much clung to the maybe 17th century idea of an absolute monarchy and absolutism. And then you had a wing of ministers who were more influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, and perhaps interested in bringing some scientific changes or scientific inspired reforms to the French state. And Louis was sympathetic more to the Enlightenment ideas than he was to the absolutist ideas. But his two younger brothers were, dead set, absolutists.
Yeah, and you wonder about the ministers. Like you said, they all have their own agendas. His brothers, who weren't very good kings themselves, you wonder if he just got bad advice all around.
Well, I think he got bad advice, and I think he got good advice. And the problem with being indecisive is he listened to both of them. I think we see a pattern where, when it comes to solving some of the issues around harvests and grains and things, Louis took some steps following the advice of physiocrats to loosen up some of the grain trade. But unfortunately, it created some hoarding episodes. So not only did grain prices rise, but then there was an increase, a decrease of availability. And ultimately, at least initially, that was not a successful reform. You'd have to think if he muscled through it, then ultimately it probably would have been a little bit more effective. But, at the moment where it got real intense, he reversed course.
Right.
And we'll see this too with financial ministers who have different ideas about how to improve the state or the state of France's finances. And those reforms are going on down the line, and then he gets blowback, and then Louis reverses course. And this happens over and over in his realm, in his time in power.
Yeah, and it wasn't all on him. He inherited a government that was already deeply in debt. But that doesn't stop France from supporting the American Revolution in the war against the British. Now, it worked out well for us here in America, and for France. They beat the British in this overseas battle. But in hindsight, was it a bad idea for France to get involved in that?
Let me answer that question a little bit differently. I mean, this was a topic of great debate within the cabinet of Louis XVI. And frankly, Louis XVI was not all that interested in helping the American colonies, because as a king, he thought it looked bad for a monarchy to be supporting a state that was trying to rebel against their rightful rulers. Mm-hmm. And so Louis really had a sort of philosophical stance that he really ultimately did not want to get involved.
Right.
But most of his ministers were in favor of getting involved. And I don't think cost was ever really an issue. I think they really wanted to get back at the British for all the losses they had suffered during the 7 Years' War. And for those reasons that Louis eventually brought around. Now, Benjamin Franklin played a role here. He was wildly popular in Paris. The French public were generally in favor of supporting the war. Of course, having no real idea of what that would mean for the French finances and French coffers, or because they don't know, that none of that's transparent.
Right.
but it ended up being a financially disastrous decision by the French state because the war ended up costing an enormous amount of money. Now, I doubt that the United States would have been able to achieve its independence without the intercession of a French army under Rochambeau, but more importantly,
The
the
Navy.
French fleet, right,
Yeah.
which ultimately chokes off Cornwallis at Yorktown. And without those ships of the line that the French provided, it's doubtful that the American colonies could have continued and ultimately emerged victorious. Ultimately, I don't think Louis thought it was necessarily a bad idea. I mean, the war continued without the Americans for 2 more years, and it sort of things went to a status quo.
Right.
But ultimately, the British did lose their most valuable colony at the time. So I think most folks regarded that as a win,
Yeah.
and the French public was happy with the results.
It's a Monday morning quarterback thing, like.
And for sure. But I mean, it definitely did not help French finances at all. The war was terribly costly.
Right. Now, I want to lead up to the storming of the Bastille in July 1789. But, basically the American War of Independence really ends 1781. The treaties, I believe, 1783. But we kind of have 6 years leading up to the storming of the Bastille, which most people say really kicked off the French Revolution. What kind of sent us down that path where we're invading the Bastille in Paris?
Yeah, this was a sort of a climax of several crises all at once. The financial crisis certainly was the main one, in that it's becoming increasingly aware that the French state is in actual danger of going bankrupt and not being able to make its payments. And French intellectuals and Louis and his cabinet all have to try and think of ways to solve this. And the members of the first and second estate who can't really see beyond the end of their noses are just, well, let's raise taxes. The French can't raise taxes. The French state could not raise taxes without calling a meeting of the Estates General, which is where representatives of the three estates would sit and meet, and then there would be a proposal for additional taxation, and then they would vote by the House. So the clergy would have one vote, and the nobility would have one vote, and all the third estate would have one vote. And
but
of course,
happened in what centuries, right? They hadn't called that in a long time.
Yeah, not since 1614. So, they had to go back into the archives and figure out how they do it. And Louis had tried calling an assembly of notables before the Estates General, which is essentially representatives of the first and second estates. And at that meeting, Louis laid pretty clear, in what condition the French state was, and essentially asked the first and second estate for some assistance and for them to give up some of their prerogatives and rights and things so the French state could have some access to some, more funds to get out of this case, get out of the situation they were in. But, the war had caused a lot of problems. Marie Antoinette's spending was an issue. She was a spendthrift and obviously was spending in part out of frustration, out of unhappiness in other areas of her life, but her spending was a problem, although I'm sure it was magnified by newspapers and things. And there was an explosion of newspapers and gossip columns and things, and at this point Marie Antoinette had been accused of bestiality, lesbian orgies, you name it.
Right.
And so that was a problem. There was an undercurrent of religious problems going on between Jesuits and the rest of France, and there was an undercurrent of anti-Christian movement that got its spark deep within the Enlightenment. Just a lot of social and political and economic problems all coming to a head, and without any they had no more recourse. Then the only recourse left was to call the Estates General,
right?
Which Louis did in 1788 to meet in May of 1789.
Right. Well, 2 months after that, in July, the powder keg of the Bastille occurs. Why is that such an important date in French history?
I will. Let me answer that, but I have one little itty bitty footnote to insert in between there.
Sure.
On the 4th of June in 1789, so about a month, 6 weeks before that, Louis and Marie Antoinette lose their oldest son.
Mm.
Louis Joseph died in June of 1789, and Louis and Marie Antoinette, despite their backgrounds, were actually hands-on parents.
Hmm.
And by this time, the two of them had come to a better understanding of one another, and I think they loved each other, Marie Antoinette and Louis, and they both certainly loved their children.
Hmm.
And so this is a loss that both of them feel personally. So in this moment of just, I mean, awesome importance for world history, they're in the midst of grieving for, the 10-year-old son they've lost, who's supposed to be the Dauphin.
Right.
So it's a tough time for Louis personally, and he's largely checked out on these matters. And so that probably aided to some of the crisis that leads up to the storming of the Bastille. So the storming of the Bastille happens on 14 July, 1789.
Hmm.
The Bastille was an ancient royal fortress on the outskirts of Paris. It had been used in the past as an arsenal, as a garrison for, keeping Paris safe or keeping France safe from Parisians. It had been used as a prison.
Right.
And so while the Estates General convenes in May of 1789, there's an immediate movement to essentially declare the Third Estate as a national, assembly, and then, negotiations back and forth between sympathetic members of the First and Second Estates. And while all of this is going on, and Louis' son's death, he has to decide how to deal with all of this mounting pressure. There's still a famine going on, and ultimately, Parisians were concerned that Louis might send in troops
Mm.
to violently suppress the Parisian sections. And so, the culmination of all of this, they panic and go to the Bastille looking for weapons. They end up breaking into the Bastille. They kill the commander of the garrison there. They did find, I don't 20 or 30,000 muskets. There were a whole bunch of muskets there, but not much of anything else. They had 7 prisoners. 3 of them were nobles that their parents essentially had put in jail. The Marquis de Sade, curiously enough, had been there up until very recently, but was transferred shortly before this. At any rate, this happens, and when Louis asked about this, or Louis asked one of his ministers about this, because he had heard that there was some trouble in Paris, and he asked his minister, "Is this a revolt?" And the minister replied, "No, sire, this is a revolution."
Mm.
So Louis is a little out of the loop.
Yeah.
You can appreciate with all the circumstances.
Part of the problem with having the court out in Versailles, you're kind of far away from the action in Paris.
Right. Well, funny that you should say that, because as you know, that's not going to last that way. And I think you have a question on that topic.
I do.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Within 3 months of the Bastille storming, King Louis loses almost all his powers to elected representatives. And we can kind of talk about what Louis could have done to keep the throne, maybe on our legacy question. But in October 1789, Versailles is stormed by an angry mob who want to kill, I think, Queen Marie Antoinette. What happens there?
Yeah, and this is a remarkable occurrence, because this is completely spontaneous, and it's almost entirely women-led. In October, the weather was foggy, cold, There's a dreary morning, and women start to queue up at the bakeries, so they can procure the bread to feed their families.
Hmm.
But again, France was going through another crop shortage. Prices were high, availability was low, and frankly, these Parisian women just got pissed off.
Hmm.
And I basically said, I mean, the basic math was, hey, I bet there's bread at Versailles. We should get Louis, bring him back to Paris, and if Louis is in Paris, then there'll be bread.
Hmm.
And so they all get together. There were thousands of them, and they march from Paris to Versailles, which is about 11 miles, chanting, singing, marching the whole way. And what an incredible sight, to see thousands of women not being led by men at this point. I mean, the men start joining.
Right.
This isn't a spontaneous event led by women. Now, when they get to Versailles, of course, the palace is completely unprepared
Right.
for these thousands of pissed off women who are now tired and hungry, want something to eat and drink. And there are Swiss guards at Versailles, but not in great numbers because nobody's expecting any kind of trouble.
Right.
And there were elements that broke into the palace, and they were looking for Marie Antoinette. In fact, Marie Antoinette, through we'll call it a secret door, a concealed door. You can see it if you tour Versailles, that they'll show you where the door is. Slipped out the back and into the private apartments right before the mob broke into her bedroom. And I mean, they symbolically destroyed the bed and mattress on which Marie Antoinette was with knives and things.
Right.
And Marie sought protection with the king. And
So
it was finally at that point that General Lafayette, the Lafayette we know from the American Revolution, who was the commander of the National Guard in Paris, finally arrives at the scene and restores some order.
right.
And ultimately convinces Louis and even Marie Antoinette, who's holding her baby, to come out onto the porches there, one of the balconies,
Balconies. Yeah.
and wave to the crowd. And that seemed to change the mood a little bit for the positive, because there were still an awful lot of people that had warm regards for Louis, not for Marie Antoinette, but certainly for Louis. But the end result is there's a negotiation, and Louis agrees to remove the royal family to the Tuileries Palace, which is in Paris.
Yeah. So her famous quote, "Let them eat cake," that never happened.
No.
No.
So the background of that quote is that if the French are starving because they don't have any bread,
Right.
that, well, if they don't have any bread, let them eat cake. And of course, cake is just bread with sugar added.
Right.
So
Right.
he never said that, although it probably reflects what the French thought of her mentality.
Right.
I mean, Marie Antoinette liked to dress up as a peasant girl and go play peasant. So she had an entire little hamlet built on the grounds of Versailles there, where she and her courtly friends would go out and it was a working farm. It had sheep and crops and things. Not that she and her courtiers did
Right.
any of that work. In fact, we have one story where Marie Antoinette was so repulsed by the smell of sheep that she had the servants douse the sheep in perfume before her friends came out there. So you can imagine the insensitivity, right? Here are peasant men who are corralling these sheep and dousing them with perfume that they will never in their entire lifetimes be able to afford for their own wives.
Right.
And they're dousing them on the sheep, so Marie Antoinette and her friends aren't inconvenienced
Yeah.
by the smell. So
Well.
the sentiment was there, although we have no evidence she ever said that in real life.
Okay. Well, moving forward in the story, like you said, Louis and his family are in Paris, and in June 1791, they attempt to flee from France, and they make it to, I believe it's Varennes.
That's correct.
What was the motive for this mad dash, and how did they get caught?
Yeah. So little background to fill in some of the gaps. So of course, after October 1789, when they're hauled back to the Tuileries,
Yeah.
I mean, they are functionally prisoners of the revolution at that point.
Yeah.
While the revolutionaries think about, okay, we got this king, what are we going to do with him?
Mm-hmm.
So, the leading plan was to create a constitution. So while they're working on the constitution, France undergoes an entire social transformation. Nobility is abolished. that they you can get divorce on demand. The entire fabric of France's society changed while Louis and Marie and the royal family are essentially imprisoned there in the Tuileries, and everybody's sort of waiting for what this constitution is going to look like. And Louis's not interested. Louis at this point has been abandoned. His brothers have hightailed it and left, as have most of the nobility. So the flight to Varennes is a plan that Marie Antoinette was particularly forceful in suggesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thought was that they would flee from Paris to the Austrian Netherlands, which is today modern-day Belgium. As the name implies, it was a possession of the Austrian state. And then the royal family there would seek the protection of Austria, which would almost certainly precipitate a war, which the end result they hoped would be that Louis would be restored to the throne as an absolute monarch.
Makes sense.
And so there were preparations made, and one of the primary movers was probably Marie Antoinette's lover, the Axel Fearson, the Swedish noble. And anyway, they came up with this plan that the king and the queen are going to travel incognito. They strips down some royal coaches of all of their gilt and designs and things. They equip these things with like a high performance chassis. They've got horses, placed at all the different, spots along the way to change out the horses. And then they're going to bolt for the border.
Yeah.
So in June of 1791, that they execute the plan. In the dead of night, under a secret tunnel, they escape the Tuileries, and then they ride like hell for the Austrian border. And they still travel pretty slowly because these carriages are still pretty laden with gear and loot. And I think Marie Antoinette took an entire China service and a silver set. So I mean, they're not exactly like traveling like light. I mean, traveling light for them, but not traveling light for the rest of us. And Louis they're almost to the Austrian Netherlands, and they're in this little town of Varennes. And they stop, and Louis moves aside the curtain to look outside. And it was just at that moment in time when he looked outside that the postmaster looked and saw Louis. And he's like, man, I know that guy. And then he pulls out a coin from his pocket, and he looks at the coin, and he looks at Louis, and he looks at the coin, and he looks at Louis, and he's like, oh my God, that's the king.
Right.
And so he alerts the local National Guard, and to make a long story short, they arrest the family and escort them back to Paris.
So close.
Now there was an element of cavalry that had been escorting Louis that had gotten separated, and if Louis had wanted to call that cavalry unit that was loyal in, there's some debate about whether they could have succeeded, but and I, through my research, perhaps some of your listeners will know, Louis was just dead set against using violence against other Frenchmen.
Yeah, which Napoleon would have no problem with a few years later.
All right. Well, and some of Louis's predecessors certainly didn't have any problems, but Louis had a real aversion he just was dead set against using military force against other French citizens. And I have not been able to ascertain where that sort of sentiment came from. In fact, there was a scuffle that broke out under the arrest, and it was Louis that diffused the situation by saying, no, I'm not gonna hurt other Frenchmen. So
I mean, that's very noble of him, to not want to.
It is, but that also means they endured so they get out to Varennes, and it does not take even 24 hours to get out to Varennes, but it takes 3 to 4 days to get back to Paris, because the streets are lined with angry French citizens,
right?
And we have all kinds of accounts about how eerily quiet it was. That the way from Varennes to Paris was lined with Frenchmen who came out to see the procession.
Yeah, and it's bad optics for the royal family to be.
Oh, it really undermined the French monarchy. And then when Louis is compelled to they finally have a constitution. and Louis is compelled to sign the Constitution several months later.
Yeah.
He does not want to participate. He does not want to be a constitutional monarch. And so, whatever instruments in the Constitution he is given to veto and to obstruct or not support, he does. And it just, at this point, the French have really had it with their monarchy.
Yeah. Well, in August 1792, mobs again stormed the royals, this time at the Tuileries Palace, and they slaughter all of the Swiss guards who protect the royal family. And I know Napoleon witnesses this event, and it really has an impact on the future emperor. What happened in this situation?
Yeah, so this, of course, what happens is that after Louis runs and he signs up as a constitutional monarch and then obstructs the progress, by exercising the powers that are given to him in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Every side thinks that by 1792, by early 17, the only way this is going to get resolved is through a war. And, the monarchists want a war so that Austria and Prussia and others can come in and reestablish Louis. And the ones that are, interested in protecting or advancing the gains of the revolution want to get rid of the king altogether.
Mm.
So in April of 1792, the entire world basically declares war on France. And the war does not go well.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, by the beginning of August 1792, the Prussians have cleared the border fortresses. They've taken Verdun. There's nothing standing between them and Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And the Duke of Brunswick had threatened to burn Paris to the ground if Louis was harmed. And so, the revolutionaries essentially, again, panic, and they storm the Tuileries. And this time it's very apparent that if they catch any member of the royal family, they're going to kill them.
Right.
So Louis leads, his family, Marie Antoinette, the kids, to the where the National Assembly is meeting and basically pleads for their protection. And, the Swiss guards who are there at the Tuileries to protect the royal family die at their posts. And I'm going from memory, John, but I think 600 of them were killed.
Yeah.
In the combat there. And
definitely several hundred.
Yeah, and God bless them. They fought professionally, and the rates of the casualties were extremely high.
Yeah.
And, Bonaparte saw this, and I don't think Bonaparte had a particular warm spot for Louis, but I think what impressed Napoleon more negatively was the violence that a crowd could produce. And that had a profound impact on him.
Yeah, and I think he kind of noted that in his back pocket. I know the guards didn't use artillery, and he also mentioned if Louis would have just shown up with a cavalry regiment, it probably would have taken care of all that. So I think he kind of just put that in the back of his mind in case that ever happened to him, which he used.
Gee, it did, didn't it? 1795 sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah. So that had a huge impact on Napoleon. Now, for France, the impact was that once the French monarchy fled the Tuileries, then the revolutionaries declared the monarchy dead and then proclaimed a republic.
Yeah,
and then at this point, the royal family's in real dire straits.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that. So Louis is arrested. He's thrown into the Temple, which is a famous prison in Paris. The government also strips all titles and honors and simply refer to him as Citizen Louis Capet. It's just a fall from grace, and it seems like every year is getting worse and worse for him.
Yeah, and of course, his ministers are gone, his brothers are gone. It's just he and Marie Antoinette and the kids. And I think so. What happens to Louis is that finally, free of all these people chirping in his ear, he finally finds, some at least personal resolve. He's digs deeper into his faith and leans ever more on his Christian faith, which had always been very strong. And that's a real rock for him. He had a pretty good idea what the end result was, or what was probably coming. And I think what he was doing was just, making right between him and his God, and also preparing for that inevitable day with a lot of stoicism.
He handled it right with a lot of stoicism and a lot of grace, quite frankly. But
yeah, I agree.
In 1792 of September, the future Marshal Kellerman beats the invading foreign armies at the Battle of Valmy. and that secures the position of the new revolutionary government. Why is this bad news for Louis?
Yeah, because of course the foreign aid is not going to be there. The Prussians turned around and went home. So there's no immediate prospect of a foreign army occupying France and Paris and saving the king. So he is now at the mercy of the revolutionaries.
Yeah. And months later, King is hauled before the convention to stand trial for high treason. A month later, he's found guilty of collusion with foreign invaders of France. Do you think he actually received anything resembling a fair trial?
So he did give. I'll answer it this way. He gave a very spirited defense, and he hired. He managed to get three really accomplished lawyers to aid in his defense. The problem was that there was a mountain of evidence, of documentary evidence, showing that Louis, in fact, had done these things. He had colluded with foreign powers to maybe intercede to save him, and in a moment of not great wisdom, he had left a document in the safe before he left on the flight of Rennes, basically just trashing the Constitution, the revolution, and all of these things were used against him. So it probably wasn't fair, but I don't think the outcome of the verdict was ever really in doubt, in part because of this monster pile of evidence that Louis had sort of amassed against himself.
Right.
They voted. The fact that he was guilty, not a single deputy voted for his innocence. So the fact that he was going to be guilty was a foregone conclusion. But then there was a lot of debate about what would happen to him. And ultimately it is, do we execute him or we do something else, life in prison or whatever.
Right.
But when you're in the middle of a war with foreign powers, you can't have the former king hanging around, because that's just an automatic rallying point.
Right.
So the conversation really started to circle or surface around, should they kill him or not? So the deputies voted, and 360 deputies voted for some version of punishment that would spare his life. And 361 deputies voted to execute him.
Okay.
So by a vote of one, they voted to terminate. So for all the folks out there you've ever heard saying, well, what does one vote matter? Well, do you think it mattered for Louis XVI? Because I think it did.
Yeah.
In fact, it was so close for these revolutionaries that they had a subsequent vote a few days later, because I don't know, one vote, man, that's pretty close. And then it was more like 380 to 320 or so. And then they decided to go ahead and execute Louis. So he is executed basically 36 hours after they finally come up with a final verdict for death.
Yeah, and I mean that was probably a tough thing to do. I mean, maybe not for someone like Joseph Fausch or some other sinister people, but to have blood on your hands to vote for the execution of a king, that must have been a tough decision for a lot of people.
Well, it's very weighty, and of course, France has never executed a monarch before Louis XVI, nor have they executed one after. So it was incredibly momentous, and the whole country felt that it was momentous.
Yeah, unprecedented.
Yeah, and it had to be. I'm just thinking about all of the overlapping sort of Venn diagrams. So that the Sanson, the executioner, was the royal executioner. He used to handle the executions that Louis XVI, called for, issued, and now he's called upon to execute Louis XVI.
Yeah. But that's a symbol of kind of the chaotic situation. I mean,
right.
One day you're the king's executioner, next day you're executing the king.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And apparently, as you saw in my tweet thread on this, there was a scuffle at the moment of the scaffold, and Sanson called Louis sire, which of course nobody had called him sire in several years.
Yeah.
And that's just old habits, but that's in that circumstance that's jarring.
Yeah. What happens to the rest of the family with Marie Antoinette and the kids?
Oh, such a tragic story. So the only child that ends up living is the oldest daughter, Maria Theresa. She is exchanged for French prisoners of war with Austria. So, and she'll live until 1851 and die in Austria. Of course, Louis Joseph, the oldest boy, had died in June of 1799, and I already mentioned that. Sophie had died in 1787 as a result of 1 year old of tuberculosis. So the one remaining son, often credited to be Louis XVII, Louis Charles, had a horrible imprisonment. At one point, he was in isolation for 6 months, and some accounts are that he was living in his own filth, and of course, hadn't seen human contact for 6 months. His care got a little bit better when the Revolutionary sent a representative to go check on him, and they were, frankly, even they were appalled at his conditions.
Mm-hmm.
He received a governor and of course was cleaned up and things, but his conditions were, he's in a moldy, wet, cold cell,
right.
And contracted a disease, probably tuberculosis, and died in 1795. He was not guillotined, but he died in prison. It was just awful. Nobody deserves the kind of treatment that he deserved, and he died in a pretty horrible circumstances as a child.
Yeah, and Marie herself was guillotined as well.
She was guillotined in October of 1793, so 10 months later. And symbolism being what it was, and of course the reflection of the revolution, Louis was taken to the Place de la Révolution, where they had erected the guillotine in a covered coach. He had his priest next to him, and the way was lined with 80,000 guardsmen, and he had a drum corps preceding him. Marie Antoinette had her hands bound in an open cart and had to make that trip.
Yeah.
So she was subjected to all kinds of abuse, and had rotten vegetables and things hurled at her, and people spit on her, and all the way from the prison to the Place de la Concorde, where it erected the guillotine.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then in both cases, the public dipped handkerchiefs into the blood for a memento, and
just tragic. Yeah. Well, obviously, without his death, Louis's death, we probably wouldn't have had a Napoleon or Napoleonic Empire. But I don't want that to be the legacy of Louis XVI. What do you think his legacy is?
That's a great question, John, and I've been pondering that since you invited me to help you record with this one. What do you say about monarchs, right? I mean, you kind of get the luck of the draw, and Louis is a tragic case because I think as a human being, Louis is a quality human being. Mm-hmm. He's smart, he's empathetic, he's loving, he was honest, he's pious. So these are all attractive qualities that you would want in a person. I think the common refrain in politics these days is, this a politician you want to go have a beer with? Mm-hmm. And I think in general, Louis is the kind of person you would want to go have a beer with. Mm-hmm. But he did not have the tools and was not prepared to be king. He didn't handle stress well. He's indecisive, and he just was not up to all of the tasks that France had to face.
Yeah, you wonder, and again, I'm playing Monday morning quarterback. If he could have done anything to keep his throne, whether it was solve the financial crisis or put artillery down every street in Paris, or if there was some way he could have kept his throne.
And you wonder, because there's still all the underlying themes, right? There's still the crop failures. There's still the Parisian or French society and the Three Estates that's completely unfair, mm-hmm. and times are changing. If you look at the revolution as a whole, to make an omelet, sometimes you have to break some eggs. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that you could have a modern France or even a modern Europe by extension through Napoleon without all the tumult and chaos and destruction that happened.
Right.
So for the kinds of changes that were needed societally, religiously, I don't know that you could have done all that without a major crisis.
Yeah. And it was. There was a lot of upheaval in that 1789 to basically 1799 timeframe. So
correct. So it really, at that point in 10 years, France is exhausted. Mm-hmm. And so you get somebody like a Napoleon who's willing to take the kernels of the revolution and forcefully set them in concrete, like he did with a financial settlement, with a religious settlement, with the land, with taxation, with all of the things. And I think the French at that point are like, okay, perfect, this works great.
Right. Well, we'll try this Napoleonic code out and see how it goes. Yeah.
Right. Right. And, today, so we still have the code, we still have the education system. There are lots of Napoleonic reforms in their spirit that still exist in France. And as we know through the course of French history, they had a lot of constitutions and a lot of government and a lot of opportunity to change those. And they've kept them because they work.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, thank you for that, Charles. A great learning experience for me on Louis XVI. And I appreciate you joining the show once again.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, John.
Yeah, and again, if my Twitter and X followers want to check out Charles's page, it's Bubbles Vampire or Bubbles Vampire.
It's actually Bubbles Vampire.
Is it Bubbles Vampire? Okay,
yeah,
great.
It is at Bubbles Vampire. Yep.
Please check out his page and give him a follow, and we'll talk soon. Thanks so much, Charles.
Thanks, John.